In May 1940, the Panzers of German General Heinz Guderian broke out of the Ardennes Forest and sped along the Somme Valley to cut off Allied troops in Flanders. Commanders and politicians in both France and Britain appeared to be astonished at these tactics. They should not have been. This is the story of how a strategy that was fundamentally developed and then discarded by the British was then used to devastating effect against them. In Britain, during the first half of the 20th century, there was a widely read monthly publication called The Strand magazine. It was in this magazine that most of the Sherlock Holmes stories were first published, and it was also the magazine responsible for making Agatha Christie a household name. Indeed, the list of contributors to the magazine is legion. In the December 1903 edition, there appeared a short story entitled The Land Ironclads. Like most of the articles in the magazine, this was a story of fiction. It was written by a young H.G. Wells in an attempt to provide perhaps a somewhat whimsical solution to the growing evidence that future conflicts would become deadlocked by modern weapons and firepower, giving all advantage in warfare to the defender. Imaginatively, Wells described a steam-driven ironclad vehicle that walked on a type of footed wheel. In his story, the ironclad reaches the enemy's trenches and through small portholes, withering rifle fire demolishes the enemy, enabling the infantry to advance unopposed across no man's land. Prophetic perhaps, but Wells, and most generals around the world at that time, were more than aware of this growing military trend. There was also another theme to this story. Wells was really making the point that less sophisticated and rural-based countries would in future struggle in any conflict with more industrialized and military-developed nations. The story was, after all, written only a year after the end of the Boer War. Another 10 years passed before this subject was revisited. Just 2 years before the outbreak of the First World War, Lancelot de Mol, an Australian engineer and inventor, submitted to the British War Office a design for an armoured vehicle that used caterpillar tracks, a form of traction already in use on American farms. But despite senior generals fully appreciating the growing advantage of defence over attack, they were unable to envisage any military purpose for such a vehicle. However, within months of the start of the First World War, British Army officers were arguing for just such a vehicle, most notably Colonel Ernest Swinton, who after serving in the Boer War had become the official historian for the Committee of Imperial Defence. With the outbreak of the First World War, he was appointed as the British Army's official war correspondent. With members of the press at the time banned from war zones, Swinton's task was to relay news, no doubt censored news, from the battlefront to the British press. While observing operations bogged down in the mud of the Western Front during the autumn of 1914, he was reminded of the caterpillar vehicles used on American farms that allegedly had remarkable cross-country performance. He put his idea for an armoured caterpillar vehicle to Colonel Maurice Hankey, a military friend and colleague who was at the time a military advisor to the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. Hankey, who it appears further embellished the idea, found himself trying to find a senior government minister who might be interested. His proposition fell on deaf ears, other than with Winston Churchill, at the time the First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill immediately attempted to enthuse Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, but he showed little interest. So Churchill established a naval committee to look into the proposal. But by January 1915, it reported that the war would probably be over before such a vehicle, now being referred to as a landship, could be designed and manufactured. That probably would have been the end of the matter had it not been for the Royal Navy's Commodore Murray Suter. Better known as a pioneer of naval aviation, Suter was working on one of Churchill's ideas of being able to land Royal Marines on the continent to attack or harass the enemy's rear. He designed, together with an engineer from Vickers, a device on a single wheel that could be pushed forward, behind which troops could shelter from enemy fire. But during trials in early 1915, the single wheel merely sank into the soft ground and could not be moved. With help from the Pedrail Transport Company of Fulham, the single wheel was replaced by caterpillar tracks. On the 16th of February 1915, Suter showed off his new design to Churchill on Horse Guards Parade in London. Churchill immediately established an Admiralty Landships Committee, giving it £70,000 for development out of the Navy's budget without even seeking permission from the Admiralty Board. Churchill appointed the Director of Naval Construction, Eustace Daincourt, as chairman, whose view was that the idea was not only technically sound, but also mechanically feasible. Daincourt's role and support of the project was critical, as shortly Churchill would be removed from the Admiralty. 2 months later in May, the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, who had so far run the war through his majority Liberal administration, formed a war coalition government. 9 Conservative MPs and 1 Labour MP were brought into the government. Churchill was demoted to the Duchy of Lancaster, a ministerial backwater, to make way for Arthur Balfour, the former Conservative Prime Minister. Churchill's influence would further wane 9 months later when he resigned altogether from the government over the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, even though the Dardanelles Commission placed no blame upon him personally. However, in the intervening period, Churchill did manage to persuade Balfour as to the merits of the project. Indeed, Balfour supported the project against the wishes of all the Sea Lords who wanted it handed over to the War Office, where as yet scant interest had been shown. So to mitigate the situation, Balfour added General George Scott Moncrieff from the Army's Royal Engineers to Daincourt's Landships Committee. In the meantime, Colonel Ernest Swinton, the British Army's press officer, had continued to advocate the need for an armoured vehicle with good cross-country ability. He managed to persuade Sir John French, at the time the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army on the Western Front, as to its merits. In turn, French now placed pressure upon the Army's senior generals in the War Office. As a result, in July 1915, Daincourt's Landships Committee became a joint naval and army project. However, little progress had so far been made as to the exact design and use of such a vehicle. Various theories and options had been discussed and abandoned, including gigantic troop carriers, articulated vehicles, and even ones that pulled trailers. So in August, the Landships Committee decided to hand over the design and construction to 2 engineers. One was William Triton, a professional British agricultural engineer, who already had experience with caterpillar-tracked vehicles. The other was Walter Wilson, an engineer who was serving as an officer with the Royal Navy Air Service Armoured Car Division, a unit responsible for protecting the Royal Navy Air Service facilities and personnel in France. Triton became primarily involved in the design and the manufacture, while Wilson took care of testing and making proposals for improvements. For example, it was Wilson's suggestions that the tracks should be extended to go right around the vehicle to enable them to cross trenches, and he also developed epicyclic gearing that would be used to reduce the number of drivers in each tank from 4 to just 1. Triton and Wilson immediately proposed that the vehicle should be a single armoured unit, weighing around 28 tons and with the ability to cross a trench 4 feet wide. It needed to be able to withstand machine gun and small arms fire in no man's land, travel over difficult terrain, crush barbed wire, and cross trenches to assault fortified enemy positions with a powerful armament. By late 1915, a number of prototypes had been built, including those known as Little Willie, followed by Big Willie, and later Mother, which became the prototype for the Mark I tank. During trials, David Lloyd George, at the time the Minister of Munitions, became interested, and he finally managed to persuade Lord Kitchener as to its potential. The French army was also beginning to take an interest and started to develop their own tank operation. Colonel Ernest Swinton's influence now appears again with the development of the Mark I tank. Concerned that hordes of German infantry might be able to swamp and capture a landship, the Mark I tank was produced in 2 forms. The male, as it was called, had a naval 6-pounder gun on each side, and the female had exclusively machine guns. It was also at this stage that landships began to be known as tanks. There are differing versions as to how this name change actually occurred. Suffice to say, the word tank was used as a form of code word to maintain secrecy, especially at a time when they were first being transported from the UK to France. The British Army now had to decide how these tanks were going to be used operationally. In February 1916, the British Army established what initially was called the Tank Detachment, command of which was given to Swinton. With growing importance within the year, this detachment had been separated from the Machine Gun Corps and redesignated the Tank Corps. Swinton's role would be administrative, running the Tank Corps from its base in the UK. This was probably just as well, because although he had long advocated their use, he quickly found that his thoughts were being surpassed by the ideas of others. Tanks were first used in a British attack on the 15th of September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. It proved to be neither a roaring success nor an unmitigating disaster. Importantly, General Douglas Haig, the new British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front, was sufficiently impressed to write,
"It has been established that the extent of the success was directly attributable to the employment of tanks. What would have proved a very difficult operation, involving probably heavy losses, was taken with greater ease, entirely owing to the assistance of tanks. We can consider that the utility of tanks has been proved."
With Haig's support, the tank was now set to play an increasingly important role during the remainder of the war. Indeed, he soon demanded that he needed 1,000 tanks on the Western Front. Shortly after their introduction, Field Command of the Tank Corps passed to Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Ellis of the Royal Engineers. He inherited a team that was already responsible for working out how to deploy and use tanks. Amongst them, the senior staff officer was Major John Fuller, later to become a Major General. Fuller was set to become the British Army's most prominent theorist in the use of tanks, deploying their use from these early days when they were little more than an attachment to an infantry operation. A man of high intellect, Fuller was a mercurial and eccentric character and looked at the world in an offbeat manner. Engaging, yet at times infuriating, he was an unconventional soldier with prolific ideas which he expressed fluently. As a progressive thinker, he hated any automatic acceptance that the traditional way was the correct way. Having been commissioned at Sandhurst in 1898, Fuller joined the Oxfordshire Light Infantry, where he gained the nickname Boney due to his admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte's military brilliance. He served with his regiment in the Boer War, and in the year before the start of the First World War, attended the British Army Staff College at Camberley. Soon afterwards he became a staff officer with 7 Corps in France, before joining, in 1916, the headquarters of the Machine Gun Corps, which was about to morph into the fledgling Tank Corps. It was Fuller who, as the senior staff officer in Colonel Ellis's team in France, planned the introduction of tanks to the front line on the 15th of September. He now became the Chief Staff Planning Officer for their use on the Western Front, and as such vigorously argued that they should not be used merely as infantry support or even as mobile artillery. His ideas varied from most military thinking, where the capture and holding of ground was seen as fundamental to winning the war. Anyway, he argued, that was the job of the infantry. It was not the best use of tanks. Instead, he advocated what he called raids. These should be short, sharp operations designed to inflict damage and losses on the enemy, often as a result of the tank's penetration of enemy lines. Raids should be supported by low-flying aircraft and an artillery barrage that did not begin until after the attack had started, thus maintaining an element of surprise. Much of his ideas were actually adopted by British generals during the final year of the war. During the futility of the Third Battle of Ypres, usually referred to as the Battle of Passchendaele, Fuller's influence became most acute. The British attacked on the 31st of July 1917 in atrocious wet conditions. In just the first day, 42 tanks were destroyed when providing infantry support. Fuller immediately managed to persuade now Brigadier Ellis that tank losses were unsustainable in the unsuitable muddy terrain of Flanders. In its place, he offered the suggestion of more suitable locations for tank raids. On the 2nd of August, Ellis messaged Haig.
From a tank point of view, the Third Battle of Ypres may be considered dead. To go on using tanks in the present conditions will only lead to good machines and better personnel being thrown away.
By the 8th of August, Fuller had produced a plan for a tank raid at Cambrai. This was an important supply centre for the German front line. Its capture would threaten the rear of the German line to the north, and therefore by implication cause difficulties for the Germans at Passchendaele. His proposal found favour with Haig, who ordered the plan to be actioned. The Royal Flying Corps was ordered to start training on ground attack tactics, with pilots being given specific targets including trenches, supply depots and enemy airfields. On the 20th November 1917, 476 British tanks attacked at Cambrai in what was to be the first mass tank assault in the history of warfare. The first 24 hours of the operation was an outstanding success. They penetrated 5 miles behind enemy lines. They captured 7,000 prisoners, and they crossed what the Germans considered to be the impregnable Hindenburg Line, all with comparatively few casualties. However, British generals had changed elements of Fuller's plan in wishing to turn this into an opportunity to take and hold ground. But British infantry were unable to keep up with the speed of the armoured advance, and British horse-mounted cavalry failed to take advantage of the penetration. Quickly, Germany mounted its biggest counter-attack so far in the war, and most of the territorial gains were soon reversed. Lessons, though, were being learnt. Britain was slowly developing a new way of fighting. Fuller continued to plan raids and most of the tank operations during the Allies' autumn offensive in 1918. Effectively, techniques in industrial warfare were being developed, as predicted by H.G. Wells. By mid-1918, Fuller was working on what he called Plan 1919, a major, fully mechanized offensive against Germany for the following year. Concentrated mobile forces aimed to create breakthroughs on a number of limited fronts, allowing for a rapid advance with tanks into the enemy's rare areas, where they would destroy supply bases and lines of communications, thus making it impossible for the enemy to continue to fight. Essentially, he was proposing an alternative to increasingly futile attempts to destroy the enemy through frontal assaults, with all the accompanying waste of human and physical resources. But in November 1918, Germany sought an armistice, and Plan 1919 was never implemented. After the war, by now a brigadier, Fuller held various leading posts within the British Army, gaining considerable recognition when drafting Britain's Principles of War. These form the foundation for all operational activity and are used to train officers in all British armed services about planning operations and their conduct of war. They also ensure that commanders take into account the legitimacy of their actions, whether legal, moral, political, diplomatic, or ethical. Principles of war differ from nation to nation. They are effectively the military doctrine of an individual nation without, importantly, compromising strategies or tactics. Today, Britain's 10 principles of war hardly vary from the 9 principles drawn up by Fuller over a century ago. Leading Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia and New Zealand have largely adopted these same principles, while the United States principles vary somewhat. For this alone, Fuller is a significant personality in 20th century British military history. However, of more significance perhaps was his post-war advocacy for mechanised warfare. In 1921, Fuller was given command of what was known as the Experimental Brigade, based at Aldershot. Here he developed his theories on mechanised forces and military strategies for tanks. And with his numerous books published under the name J.F.C. Fuller, he would make a significant impact on military thinking, which led to the development of armoured warfare in the Second World War. Assisting him with the Experimental Brigade as Brigade Major was an up-and-coming British Army officer called Richard O'Connor. Like Fuller, O'Connor had witnessed the futility of frontal assaults, and as a battalion commander during the final year of the First World War, he had been successful in developing flanking operations. His experience now with the Experimental Brigade would lay the foundations for his later stunning victories as a general in the Western Desert during the early part of the Second World War. In 1940, using tactics developed under Fuller, O'Connor, with just 2 divisions, would defeat an entire Italian army 5 times his size. That story is told in a separate video. It was during his time with the Experimental Brigade that Fuller struck up a rapport with the writer Sir Basil Liddell-Hart. As an increasingly famous and prominent military historian, his books proved influential amongst both military strategists and politicians. After his experiences in the trenches of the First World War, Liddell-Hart argued passionately that frontal assaults were bound to fail and should be replaced by fast-moving armoured formations. Liddell-Hart had been barely old enough to join the army at the outbreak of the First World War. He immediately volunteered and was commissioned into the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. His war was eventful. He suffered numerous serious concussive injuries from shelling. He was wounded at the Battle of the Somme, and later he was seriously gassed. His compound injuries resulted in 2 mild heart attacks, which denied him any future military career. Instead, he became a renowned journalist and writer, with military history as his prime topic. With Fuller as the military theorist and strategist, and Liddell-Hart largely commentating on much of Fuller's thinking, they were by the mid-1920s proposing that the British Army should consist of units of combined arms. Armour, infantry and artillery should be integrated exactly as what would happen later in German Panzer divisions. They also believed that these units should have close air support, making the RAF an integral part of the battle. The British Army appeared initially to go along with this thinking, as in 1927, Fuller's role was elevated by him being given command of a new experimental mechanised force based at Tidworth on Salisbury Plain. However, it soon emerged that his new force was required to carry out additional duties that Fuller considered to be totally superfluous to its prime aim, and without the resources to do it. In reality, cutbacks in the British Army were by now cutting very deep. Unhappy with the situation, Fuller threatened to resign. With Fuller's strong support amongst the popular press, the British Army feared a PR disaster. As a way out, they offered him a fact-finding mission in India, which he accepted and which would form the basis for a further book by Fuller. In truth, Fuller's mechanised warfare project was facing severe difficulties in Britain. It lacked strong support from conservative-minded senior generals who themselves were exasperated by having to manage cutbacks enforced upon them by the British government. Following his trip to India, Fuller decided to retire from the army to devote himself entirely to writing and advocating his military theories. Meanwhile, within 2 years, the new experimental mechanised force in Tidworth had been disbanded as cutbacks deepened. By 1931, at the height of the Great Depression, defence spending in Britain had reached its lowest point yet. Just 14% was being spent each year on defence compared to the early 1920s. British governments had adopted a policy called the 10-year rule, based on the notion that there was unlikely to be another war within the next 10 years, and therefore little money needed to be spent on defence. All three armed services found themselves having to manage decline. The period leading up to 1931 had also been a period of considerable political turmoil in Britain. That year, Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government collapsed, following a split within the party over whether there should be further cuts in public expenditure, especially unemployment benefit. The 1931 general election brought a new national government to power. This consisted of the Conservative Party in alliance with some Liberal and a few Labour MPs. Ramsay MacDonald continued as Prime Minister, having been expelled from the Labour Party, but his failing health and accusations of pacifism in the face of a new threat from Adolf Hitler brought his resignation. He was replaced by the Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin in June 1935. More importantly, in 1931, MacDonald appointed Neville Chamberlain as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He would be successful in repairing much of the nation's finances, remaining in post until succeeding Baldwin as Prime Minister in 1937. Chamberlain had already been galvanised by the writings of Liddell Hart, particularly his assertions that the RAF's future role would be much greater than before. Chamberlain took it upon himself to immediately increase government funding specifically to the RAF, enabling Fighter Command to be established in 1932. Without that, Britain may not have been able to defend itself in the Battle of Britain. However, it was not until 1936 that the British Army saw any meaningful increase in its budget, some years after both the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force had received substantial increases. In 1933, Field Marshal Sir Archibald Montgomery Massingberd became the new head of the British Army. He was a Francophile and was responsible for devising Britain's defensive policy, which was merely to assist the French in any future continental war. He had little respect for Fuller or Liddell Hart, and at the same time believed there was still a wartime role for horse-mounted cavalry. He was, though, supportive of armoured units, probably more so than many of the other senior generals. He made an attempt to progress armed tactics through Brigadier George Lindsay, the commander of the remnants of the experimental mechanized force, which had now become the experimental motorized infantry brigade, and also a Brigadier Percy Hobart, who he appointed as commander of Britain's first permanent tank brigade. Lindsay had previously worked closely with Fuller. Hobart is the commander best known for developing equipment to clear the beaches on D-Day, often referred to as Hobart's funnies. The problem was that these two characters did not get on, and they rarely agreed with each other. Numerous acrimonious disputes resulted, which prevented any real advance in British armoured thinking or development. In the resultant vacuum, Montgomery Massingberd opted to develop medium to small tanks of around 16 tons. As a comparison, the Sherman tank used later in the war by the Allies weighed around 35 tons, while modern battlefield tanks like the British Challenger 2 weigh 65 tons. Constructing such small tanks was, of course, just another example of a money-saving process, exasperated by the fact that they were all fitted with inadequate existing, commercially available lorry engines. Such was the parlous state of the British Army when Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937. He immediately appointed Liddell Hart as his military advisor and arranged for him to work closely with the new Secretary of State for War, Leslie Hoare Belisha, in attempting to prepare the British Army for a possible war.
In an arming world, we couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defense forces again, and we had to pay for it. Here's this great program of defense, which has somehow got to be squeezed into the next few years. It'll involve an expenditure of some hundreds of millions of pounds, but it will all be spent in the country, and that means steady employment and good wages for a long time to come.
But the issue that continued to dog British rearmament was the imbalance between infantry and armour. Insufficient resources were given to armour because, frankly, it was much quicker and cheaper to create fresh infantry battalions than armoured regiments. This was to cause difficulties for British forces, especially in the Western Desert, where until the autumn of 1942, the British Army did not have the equipment to deal with the Blitzkrieg-type tactics of Erwin Rommel. Later in the war, many infantry battalions, even ones with long and historic traditions, were speedily and temporarily converted to armoured units. Meanwhile, in Germany in 1931, a rising star within the German army called Heinz Guderian was appointed Chief of Staff of Germany's motorized troops. At the time, Germany was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles from having any tanks. This was all about to change when Hitler and the Nazis came to power 2 years later. Guderian, born in Prussia in 1888, was descended from a long line of Prussian soldiers and well understood his country's tradition for battlefield maneuver and the use of concentrated forces. He became increasingly fascinated with the potential for armoured warfare, blaming Germany's loss in the First World War upon their lack of tanks. This assertion was controversial, but it raised his profile within the army and led to him being sent to assess some armoured manoeuvres in the Soviet Union. He was also carefully watching British developments under John Fuller. Using his own money, he purchased and had translated into German publications by both Fuller and Liddell Hart. By 1931, Fuller had written 4 books on mechanized warfare. Tanks in the Great War, published in 1920. The Reformation of War, published in 1923. The Foundations of the Science of War, published in 1926. And On Future Warfare, published in 1928. Memoirs of an Unconventional Soldier would follow in 1936. And additionally, his lectures during the 1930s entitled Field Service Regulations 3 were carefully studied by the German General Staff. Guderian drew heavily upon Fuller's theories in these books, especially the ideas that tanks should be used as independent offensive units with integrated infantry and artillery support. Paramount to all of this was good communications and a flexible command structure. Fuller clearly detailed how speed, mobility and surprise could decisively win battles, ideas that significantly came part of the development of the Panzer divisions and the doctrine of mechanized offensive warfare. Enforced military limitations before 1933 had engendered a military rethink in Germany. Traditionally, Prussia had used a strategy often referred to as Schwerpunkt. The nearest equivalent in the English language to this word is focus. However, Prussian army commanders used the word in a wider context to describe a tactic based upon a concentration or a centre of gravity. Historically, many outstanding military commanders, from Alexander the Great of ancient Macedonia to Prussia's Frederick the Great, believed that by destroying the opposing army's centre of gravity, the battle would be won. Prussians had always aimed to achieve this swiftly, due to the country's historic, relatively small and limited economic resources. Now, with Germany once again facing military limitations, German thinking of the 1920s was to avoid unnecessary attrition, and instead of concentrating on their opponent's centre of gravity, they should concentrate against an enemy's weakest point. This thinking fitted with much of what Fuller was saying, especially over his preference for what he had called raids during the First World War. With encouragement from his commanding officer, the Commander-in-Chief of Germany's motorized troops, General Oswald Lutz, in 1937 Guderian wrote and published his highly influential book called German Panzers, in which Guderian proposed 6 innovations that drew heavily from Fuller's writings. Concentration of armoured forces, mobility and speed, combined arms doctrine, decentralized command and flexibility, psychological and strategic impact, innovative training and doctrinal development. With Hitler determined to rebuild Germany's military strength regardless of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, money was poured into a refreshed German army keen to take on new ideas and thinking. The British Army, by comparison, with negligible funding, remained complacent and moribund in both thought and deed. In 1935, Fuller was the only foreigner to be invited to watch Nazi Germany's first armoured manoeuvres. What he saw was panzer divisions established very much along the lines that he had advocated in Britain. Guderian was by now in command of one of the original panzer divisions before, in 1938, replacing General Lutz as commander of the Panzer Corps. Then in April 1939, Fuller was invited as a guest of honour to Hitler's 50th birthday parade. For 3 hours he watched Germany's mechanised and motorised units parade past the Führer, after which Hitler turned to Fuller and said,
"I hope you were pleased with your children."
To which Fuller replied,
"Your Excellency, they have grown up so quickly, I barely recognize them."
Germany's campaigns in Poland, in the Battle of France, during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, and Rommel's tactics in the Western Desert were all a byproduct of this strategic development. Fuller and Liddell Hart had provided the theories and the tactics for modern mechanized warfare, but it was Guderian and German generals who translated them into action. Guderian was one of the very few senior German generals who did not have to face the Nuremberg trials. Instead, he used his time writing his wartime memoirs in a book called Panzer Leader. This was the first publication by a senior German general, and it led to him being called the father of Blitzkrieg. However, the term Blitzkrieg requires some evaluation. The phrase was actually never used by either the German army or the Luftwaffe. One of its first appearances is in a German published book whose title translates as German War Strength. It was written in 1938 by a Jewish Marxist political economist and refugee from Nazi Germany called Fritz Sternberg. In the same year, copies of the book were also published in London and in Paris. This book makes no mention of any military tactics, nor does it suggest that the German armed forces had evolved a radically new operational process. But it did maintain that, in the author's opinion, Germany was not prepared economically for a long war, but it might win a short or quick war, which he called a blitzkrieg. Then in September 1939, the British press picked up this phrase to describe Germany's swift success in Poland, and during the same month, Time magazine described the German military action as
a war of quick penetration and obliteration, a blitzkrieg, a lightning war.
It was not until after the Battle of France in May 1940 that the term started to be used by the press in Germany. Indeed, Heinz Guderian himself was later to state that the expression was devised by the Allies. He wrote,
"As a result of the successes of our rapid campaigns, our enemies coined the word blitzkrieg."
In his post-war writings, Guderian went on to acknowledge the work of Fuller and Little Hart, saying that he adapted their theories to suit the German military context. Meanwhile, Fuller, in his 1948 publication about the Second World War, asserted that his theories had been vindicated by what had occurred during the war. Then, in his final book, The Conduct of War, published in 1961, he wrote,
"It is not destruction that is war's ultimate aim, but peace. Peace should be the ruling idea of policy, and victory the only means towards its achievement."
British politicians of the late 1920s and early 1930s clearly paid little heed to this type of thinking and were happy to shelter, with complacency, behind the near-disastrous 10-year rule. As a result, it took 3 years of fighting from 1939 to 1942 before Britain was in a position to seriously compete with Germany on the battlefield. So have British politicians, or indeed politicians from any other democratic nation, learnt the lessons of such a deficient defence policy like the 10-year rule? Or has the so-called peace dividend, following the end of the Cold War, been viewed by many politicians in a remarkably similar manner?